why it's so important that as you're picking your topics and you're coming up with your content, that you're keeping, yes, your audience in mind, but then when you're titling it and you're talking through it, to use words and phrases very organically. Don't just throw random keywords in random places because that doesn't really make any sense. Google's going to be like, wait, what? So make sure that you are using these keywords, long tail keywords preferably, that is going to help you to allow when Google listens that they hear exactly what it is that you need them to hear. Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Hello, Alicia here, of course, and so excited to chat with you today about SEO. I know I'm excited every week, and you've kind of just come to expect me being excited about stuff because podcasting is exciting, and I am obsessed with podcasting. Obviously, I've created an entire business around it, but I just love all of the other aspects that go into podcasting, not just being able to share your voice and express what you want to express, but the marketing, the research, the incredible launches that we've been able to create, and the communities that we're able to create with a podcast are just, like chef's kiss. Mwah. So incredible. And that's why I love podcasting. But today we're talking on a new series. How many times can I say I'm excited about something? Probably 100 more times. Anyway, I'm doing a tech tips series for the month of May 2022. But if you're listening to this in the future, hello, how is the weather? I'm sorry, I'm in a mood today, guys. Obviously, you can tell I'm just coming off of a cold. I'm feeling great, and I finally feel good in my kind of body, and I'm able to talk without getting too winded. So, hello, and welcome to my excitement. Back to the podcast. The Tech Tip series is going to be where I'm going to break down some very technical things that have to do with podcasting and are really, really important on the back end. And yes, we love marketing. Yes, we love launching. Yes, we love monetization. And yes, we love content. But if you're not really sure how to figure out the other stuff, then sometimes it doesn't always work out and you're not going to be able to get the incredible results that you want to get. So today we are talking in the first of our Tech Tips series, and it is SEO for your podcast. So SEO, what is it? SEO is search engine optimization. And what that means is that you are ensuring and optimizing your podcast, your blog, your content in a way that will allow search engines like Google, YouTube, and Pinterest to find you more easily. There are over 850,000 active podcasts. Yes, 850,000. And those are active ones. I'm not going to even talk about the ones that have stopped recording or are like OG podcasts that are no longer around. Active podcasts that are releasing episodes on a regular basis. You might be thinking, well, then there's no space for me, Alicia. Thanks. Good day. But that's not exactly true. What this means is that there's only about one podcast for every 10,000 people. So one podcast per somewhere between 9 and 10,000 people. So there's not a lot of podcasts per the amount of people that there are in the world. So there's plenty of room for you. Also, most people who listen to podcasts on a weekly basis listen to more than one. And it's usually anywhere between 5 and 9 podcasts that they'll listen to in a week. Just because there are 850,000 podcasts in the world that are active and publishing regularly does not mean that there is no space for you. What it does mean, though, is that we have to work to ensure that the people who we want to see our podcast can actually see it and find it and have the ability to be able to find your content, right? So we want that to work. And so search engine optimization is a great way to be able to ensure that people are going to find your podcast out of the 850,000. Breaking it down even further, I've said this before on the podcast, but Google does not index your podcast based on the actual overall show description. It is optimizing your podcast episodes. So if someone searches SEO for podcasts, then hopefully this episode will show up. Not necessarily my podcast in general, because it's not really a podcast about SEO. I want to make sure that when people search SEO for podcasts, that my podcast episode, this one specifically, is going to show up. But that's why it's so important that every single episode is optimized. So here are 9 ways to ensure that your podcast episodes are optimized for search engines. Those search engines, again, are Google, YouTube, and Pinterest. Those are the search engines that we're talking about when I'm saying search engine optimization. Number 1 is to speak clearly. Google listens and quote unquote reads, I've got like little bunny ears over here, reads your podcast to understand what it's about. And so they have that, I don't even know what it's called, AI something, whatever, where they're able to quickly listen to the podcast and determine what it's about. So you want to ensure that you are saying things in your podcast episode like SEO for your podcast, like I just did there, to ensure that they are listening. And when they listen, they hear those keywords that you've kind of predetermined that your episode is going to be about. And this is where and why it's so important that as you're picking your topics and you're coming up with your content, that you're keeping, yes, your audience in mind, but then when you're titling it and you're talking through it, to use words and phrases very organically. Don't just throw random keywords in random places, because that doesn't really make any sense. And it's not going to work well for you in that Google's going to be like, wait, what? That didn't read like a normal language. So what are you doing? So make sure that you are using these keywords, long tail keywords, preferably like SEO for your podcast or SEO, or ensuring your podcast has SEO, like things like that, that is going to help you to allow when Google listens that they hear exactly what it is that you need them to hear. So speaking clearly is number 1. Number 2, transcripts. Transcripts are great because they allow you to make your podcast more accessible for the hearing disabled, which, yes, we are all for ensuring that the people around you and the people of the world who have disabilities, that they have a way to listen or read your podcast. So transcripts are great for that reason, but also because when you upload your transcripts, and some podcast hosts will allow you to do that within their kind of the back end of their podcast host or their website, but you can always add it to your own website or add a hyperlink to a Google document which has it. So I think this is always a great strategy and always something that is very, very helpful for people who are maybe disabled and aren't able to listen to your show, like I said. But for Google, they can then match what they already hear you say with what's written, and it allows them to see it a little more clearly of like, have you ever tried to talk to Google and hopefully, and it's totally a she, hopefully she doesn't come on as I'm saying these things, but if I say, hey, Google, and she did, oh my goodness, stop listening to me. If I say that, you know what I'm talking about, and I say something and she's like, did you say this? No, I didn't say that. That's not what I meant. I'll get some type of like think back, that is not exactly what I was looking for. Most of the time she understands me, but sometimes if I'm like in a rush or whatever, you know what I mean? You guys are picking up what I'm putting down. So in those moments, it's important that you have the transcripts. So Google has something that they can marry what they're already reading with. So that's why that's important. Number 3 is a website or a web page where you are kind of housing your podcast information. This helps because then Google says, oh, wait, yes, I see your podcast. It's on here. Great. Oh, you have a website too, and your podcast is on there too. These two are the same thing, and it's more credible. So I'm just trying to break it down in layman's terms. It's explaining these things to you. Kind of like how I wish someone would have explained SEO to me when I first started my business and was trying to blog, right? This is what how I'm trying to explain this to you. Number 4, show notes or your podcast episode description. You want to ensure that these are not, this episode is about podcast SEO, and then drop some links. That's not what you want your show notes to look like. I cannot tell you how many times I have looked at someone's show notes and thought, oh, this is a little sad. We want more content. We need more information in the show notes that is going to allow Google to know this is what the episode is about. So this is what my typical show notes look like. My first sentence is an overview of what I'm talking about. So maybe for this one, it'll say something like, did you know there are 850 active podcasts in the world? That's why it's super important to use SEO for your podcast. SEO allows you to optimize your podcast for search engines so that your shows can show up more easily in people's searches. In this episode of the Listeners Leads podcast, we are talking about SEO for your podcast. See, I said SEO for your podcast twice in that first paragraph. It's also the title of this episode. So I want to make sure that when people are looking for information about search engine optimization for their podcast, that they find this episode, that they are able to find it because my show notes are optimized, my title is optimized, which we'll get into that in a second. So show notes, making sure your description has those keywords and is infiltrated with them. Number 5 is title. You want to make sure that the title you've picked actually has those keywords in it, like SEO for your podcast. You want to make sure that when you're titling your show, and we had this recently with a client where she wanted to title her show, Why I Don't Drink the Kool-Aid. And as much as I love the idea of titling a podcast episode, Why I Don't Drink the Kool-Aid, as a cult survivor, I get it, right? But it doesn't really tell anyone what that episode is about. And so we had to change the title to something that made more sense for her topic and would tell her audience right away, this is what this episode is about. So when you're titling your podcast episodes, make sure that you're using titles that are very clear and use your keywords. Number 6, make sure your podcast is on Google Podcasts. For most podcast hosts, within 2 weeks, Google will find your podcast and automatically put it up on their platform. But make sure, just go through and ensure that you have said, hey, look, I am the owner of this podcast, that you have grabbed that slot of yep, this is mine, give me all the stats, and that it is actually up on Google Podcasts. Number 7, metadata. So this is just that back-end information on your audio file or on your documents, things like that, ensuring that the actual title of your podcast episode, that the artist is you, so that way it's got your information in that back end, that the album is your podcast, so that way it knows, hey, look, this matches with this podcast, And then when you do upload that, make sure that you have all that metadata in the back end corrected and good to go. Number 8, tags. So for tags, you can use these as kind of like, this is what we're talking about in this episode. This is what's important. Throw a few of those into the episode description or episode backend to ensure that it makes it super easy and clear for Google to even further, or any of the other search engines to even further understand what it is that your podcast episode is about. And the last one, number 9, is sharing your podcast information on social media. So putting links. And as you share about your podcast, Google is also looking at social media platforms when it's looking for information. So if you're sharing about a podcast episode and you have the link there, it will see, hey, look, this is a really popular topic and these types of people are looking at it. And we're going to make sure that these people see this podcast episode because it aligns with the things that they're already looking at on social media. So that is how making sure that you're sharing about your stuff on social media, providing links. These are all things that are going to allow you to optimize your podcast for search engines. So, breaking it down again, speak clearly, offer transcripts, have a website or web page, make sure your show notes are optimized, make sure your title has clearly stated what your podcast episode is about, make sure your podcast is on Google Podcast, ensure that you have all that metadata filled out, use your tags, and share your podcast on social media. These are all things that you can very easily do. They're not going to take a lot of effort or extra time on your part. So make sure you do them. And that is my tech tip for this week. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.